Good evening and welcome once again to Letchworth Cable Access. I'm Kyle Adamczak, and tonight we have as our guest Mike Lindsay from Castile, who had the adventure of a lifetime, or at least the adventure of a lifetime for a history buff, and in particular a World War II history buff. And it had to do with flying a plane, a warplane, over to Europe for the D-Day commemoration, but we're going to let Mike tell us about it. It was the Whiskey 7. So I guess we'll start off first is, what is the Whiskey 7?
Whiskey 7 is a 1943 Douglas C-47. The civilian version was a DC-3. Our plane participated in World War II, basically in the D-Day invasion and also Market Garden Operation Varsity. It hit some of the big operations they had towards the end of the war from 44 on. But it did serve in North Africa and Italy before it was transferred over to the European theater up in England.
So it was a transport plane.
Troop transport, yes.
And okay, so what did it do? It took off from United States, took off from England, and then it landed the troops on the ground, or how did it work?
What it did is it was based, for the D-Day invasion, it was based at Cottesmore, England, an airfield there. And what they did is they actually had the paratroopers in it. And they would actually fly the paratroopers to the drop zones, and these guys would jump out of the airplane into the war. And it also it would haul supplies every once in a while, but its main function was as a paratrooper drop plane.
Okay. Now, what does Whiskey 7 stand for?
Well, actually, on the side of the aircraft, you'll see a W7 painted right behind the pilot and co-pilot's windows. That was an identifier for D-Day. There were different groups. You'll see like D8, J4. This was in a group. It was W7. And then they had their own individual numbers in that group. And it was just easy. It just picked the moniker of Whiskey 7. And the museum kind of put that moniker on it.
So it wasn't known as that during the war?
No, during the war it would have been the regular phonetic, which and it escapes me. I want to say William 7, but we just figured Whiskey 7. You know, it was easier to say. It sounded more appealing to people. So it just kind of, it started one day and it stuck. So we call her Whiskey 7.
So it was a troop transport plane. Now, where was it built? Do you happen to know?
Actually, it was built in California at the Douglas factory in Santa Barbara. And that was built in early 1943.
So then it was flown from California to the East Coast and then to Europe?
Yes.
Where it went into service? Or?
It flew into Wright-Patterson, and that's in Ohio. There it was picked up as crews. It went to the East Coast, and then it actually took the southern route because it actually served, in Italy first and in North Africa, where it was used as a supply ship, jumping people, and it saw quite a bit of action there. Kind of interesting that, to kind of get off, but right now we're doing some work on it, winter maintenance, and we're recovering the elevators in the back, and we actually found bullet holes in the metal of the elevators once we took all the fabric off. And we thought, well, no, it can't be, but if you fold the metal back, it's a bullet hole. Now, whether it was received in Italy, North Africa, or the European theater in one of the operations it took part in, we'll never know. But I can honestly tell somebody, yes, it has bullet hole in it. I'm asked that all the time. Well, how many bullets did it take? We don't know. They don't keep those records. But now I can honestly tell somebody it was hit by a bullet.
So now from 2015 viewpoint, now do you patch up the bullet holes? Do you replace the parts, or do you leave them there as a souvenir?
Actually, what it was is somebody had patched over it in the past. Because, 70 years, it went through a lot in 70 years after the war. So it probably was patched up after it received it and recovered. And we've left it just the way it is. With the original patch on it, we've covered it over so that we know that it's always there. We're going to leave it. That's part of its history. We can't take it away from it.
So now, after World War II, what became of the plane?
Actually, after World War II, it went to Ramstein, Germany, where it started the 37th Airlift Wing. And kind of interesting about that is our airplane, and it's been misquoted in interviews last year, our airplane is the only original airplane that started the 37th Airlift Wing in Ramstein, Germany that's still flying. It got construed as it's the only C-47 from the war still flying. That's not true. There's actually a lot out there. But after the war, it went to Ramstein, where it was part of the 37th Airlift Wing. After its military service, it was sold as surplus. And it changed hands a few times, private owners, companies. It did do passenger flights in Canada. Somewhere in my massive paperwork that I have that's probably 3 feet high from research over 11 years, I have a picture of it in its colors, red and white, when it was in Canada. Then it was sold to a gentleman named Bill Dollar in Plattsburgh, New York. He brought it down to Plattsburgh from Canada, and he repainted it in the military D-Day markings that it has now. And then it was sold to another gentleman. The name escapes me, and I apologize for that. It's too many names to try to remember. But he was a vet of World War II, and then he moved to New York City after the war and did very well in real estate. And he wanted something as a toy, so he bought this airplane. And
Big
it was
toy.
it was fully decked out with carpeting, a wet bar, tables, chairs, a lavatory, a kitchen, everything. And so he used that as his personal little toy, basically right up until the time he passed away. And we at the museum received a phone call one day.
This is the National
Warplane
Warplane
Museum.
Museum in Geneseo.
That's correct, yes. We received a phone call one day from his family that informed us that their father gave us the backstory, and they said, look, we have his airplane, and it's a C-47, and we wanted to know if you wanted it. We'll donate it to you. Well, you're not going to turn something like that down.
Yeah.
You don't find those every day. Even though there's a lot out there, you don't find them. So they donated the C-47 to us, and that was roughly 11 years ago when it came in. And it had the markings on it. It was painted the color it is now, and it had the D-Day stripes. It had different identifying marks. It had 3H on it, I believe, back then. And we saw the aircraft and looked inside and thought, oh boy, this is great. Well, we had an old mechanic there named Eddie Hopkins. And he'd been with the museum since its inception back in the 80s when they first started out. And he was with them when they went through their split a few years, like 20 years back. And he says, now look, we got to find out if this is legal. Well, long and short, the interior of this aircraft was illegal. So one of our members back then started looking up the serial number just to get a little history on the airplane. And we started finding out that this plane actually participated in World War II. It actually participated in D-Day. And at that point, everyone that was involved with the aircraft got together and said, look, let's put it back to the way it looked like during the war. So one weekend, 5 of us, 6 of us just started taking all this stuff out of the aircraft till it was bare interior. And we replaced the floor and slowly but surely putting it back to the way it looked on D-Day.
So how did you make it go from illegal interior to legal interior? What was the issue?
Well, when they put the interior in the aircraft, there's certain requirements that the FAA has for interior. It has to be fireproof. It has to have this. And Ed taught me a trick to find out. Take a piece of the material, take a lighter, and you light it. If it burns, it's illegal.
I see.
Every bit that we pulled out of that aircraft, as soon as I touched a flame to it, it burst into flames in my hand. And the fact there's also paperwork that has to be filed to do things to aircraft. It's called a 337. And mysteriously, all the paperwork for this interior that was put in was mysteriously lost. So there's no proof that it was legally done to begin with. So we decided, look, we don't want any problems because we want to fly this airplane. So let's just take it out now that we know that it's starting to learn its history, its lineage of what it did, what better way to do it than to put it back to the way it looked like on D-Day?
So then you restored the interior.
Slow process, yes. We started by stripping and painting the interior.
Now, how did your participation in the D-Day commemoration of last year come about?
Okay, about two and a half years ago, one of our members, Gary Mitchell, came to us on one of our Saturday get-togethers where we do a lot of the maintenance. And he had this wild idea. He says, look, we know this went to D-Day. We know, it had a proud history during the war. He says, what if we took it back to Normandy for the 70th anniversary of D-Day? At first we all laughed. We're like, come on, how can we do this? So we decided, well, let's look into it, see what can happen. And it just snowballed from there to the point of, basically the way it happened, if Gary didn't have that idea, it wouldn't have happened at all. So we slowly started the process of getting the airplane ready to make the trip. A lot of people, they had suggestions like, well, why don't we get together with the Navy and put it on a carrier and take it across? Or what if we take it apart and ship it and then put it back together? We decided if we were going to do this, it was going to fly or it wasn't going to go. So basically it was 2 years of maintenance along with our regular air show schedule, because we take this airplane to air shows. So during the winter we have about a 4-month period where it doesn't fly, and that's where we have to do all of our maintenance every year. So the last 2 years during the winter, the maintenance program has been stepped up about 3 levels to try to get everything done, from making sure the 2 brand new engines on this aircraft, to have taken the landing gear out, totally rebuilding everything, repainting it, putting it back in, upgrading the radio system to where it's a total modern avionics on the inside. It doesn't look it, but it is. It retains something like from the 90s, but it doesn't look like stuff you'd see in a jet airliner today. To making sure that the people that were going to do it were ready to go. To make sure we had the supplies, the materials that we needed, as far as, making sure we had oil over there and spare parts. The plane is at that time 74 years old from the time it was built, or 73 years old. Yeah, that's a long journey for that aircraft to take again, over and back.
Yeah.
And we wanted to make sure we had everything available to us to make it happen, going over and coming back.
Now, did you contact organizers of the commemoration, or did they contact you? Or?
Actually, Gary contacted them first and said, we'd like to be involved. What do we have to do? Well, to do this, there's a ton of paperwork to go through with the French government. There's a ton of paperwork to go through any country that you're going to land in or fly through. There are certain permits you have to have. There's, landing fees. A couple of places we landed, they waived that for us because they thought what we were doing was great. Other places, we paid the full shot. But we had like a handler from over in Europe that knows how to deal with all this, and basically got the stuff set up for us. We just had to follow through with everything, but he gave us the guidelines.
Yeah.
And that's what we followed, and everything worked out perfect.
Now, you got the Whiskey 7 ready to fly to Europe for the D-Day. Before we go on any farther, maybe you can just give us, for somebody watching that might not know or needs their memory refreshed, what was D-Day briefly? June 6, 1944.
D-Day was the big invasion, the big push to finally put an end to this war that they'd been fighting since the attack of Pearl Harbor. And it was Canada, England, United States. It was just the big thing to take Europe back.
Yeah.
It was one of those, we're going to do this and we're going to keep moving forward. We're not turning back no matter what happens. We're going to do it. And it was probably the largest land and sea and air-based assault. In fact, it was.
Yes, I was going to say.
Of the entire war.
I think in history, isn't it? The largest invasion?
Oh, yes.
So they had set up the commemoration, and last year was the 70th anniversary of it. Now, you got the Whiskey 7 ready to fly to Europe. Who was in the crew?
There was, we had 2 pilots, the main pilots. There's a total of 5 of us that flew it over.
Uh-huh.
There was Chris Paul Hemus and John Lindsay, and yes, he is related to me.
How is he related?
We're distant cousins. We found that out. We've known each other for 4 years. I think he's been flying the aircraft with us.
Yeah.
And it got to one of those things. It's like, well, you know, my family came from Scotland. I said, well, so did mine. And doing some digging, we found out that we are related. But John and Chris were the main pilots. John is retired U.S. Air Captain, and Chris is still an active U.S. Air Captain. And they have hundreds of Atlantic crossings under their belts. That was their route to go to cross the Atlantic when they flew for U.S. Air. There was myself, there was Craig Wadsworth, and there was Naomi Wadsworth. So the 5 of us flew the plane over.
Is there any story behind how you got to join the crew, or is it just
Pure
because?
luck. I really don't know the reason why I got the opportunity. I'd like to think it maybe because out of everybody that was involved in the museum when we got that aircraft, I'm the only one left still with it. I mean, we've had a lot of people come in, a lot more people join, they're involved with it. But the original group that was there, as far as working on it day to day, I think I'm, if not the only one, at least maybe there's one more person there. And I'm the crew chief of the aircraft. That was handed down to me when Ed Hopkins passed away a few years back. And probably my love for the airplane. And they kind of stuck me in charge of restoration of the airplane. So I'm the one that gets to dig up all the original parts to put on it to make it look good. So, and I think that's how I got the opportunity. I just contributed to luck.
If you're just tuning in, our guest tonight is Mike Lindsay, who had the adventure of a lifetime for a history buff. He was a member of the crew of the Whiskey 7's flight to Europe to take part in the 70th anniversary commemoration of the D-Day invasion. Now you got the Whiskey 7 ready to fly to Europe. You got your crew together, and you take off and start going. How long does it take to get over there in that plane?
Actually, it took us 23 hours to cross the Atlantic.
Now, is that similar, the same amount of time it would have taken during the war? Did you have some problems? Or?
Actually, we were quite lucky. We had a tailwind all the way over. So we actually made time. We were thinking it was going to take us, close to 25, 27 hours. I mean, a couple, 3 hours doesn't sound like a lot, but on a 70-year-old aircraft, those extra 3 hours you don't have to put on the engines is a godsend.
Yeah. Now, you didn't go nonstop.
No. We started from Geneseo and went to Maine, stayed the night, and we took off from Maine and went to Goose Bay, Labrador, and then from Goose Bay, Labrador, we went to Greenland,
Now, the purpose of these stops was to refuel?
Refuel, stay the night, and this was actually one of the original Blue Spruce routes that these aircraft took going over to Europe when they got delivered there.
So you're going over the same trail that it would have gone over during the war.
Correct. And we landed in Narsarsuaq, Greenland, which is probably, to me, the most beautiful place on Earth. At any time, you can stop and you can hear a pin drop. It's so quiet and peaceful there. And it was also an air base during the war. And a lot of people don't realize that bringing wounded troops back, or even troops that died during the war, that was one of the stops. They had a big hospital there. They cared for the troops. It was called Blue E West 1. And that stayed as an Air Force base until, I believe, the early 70s when they finally closed it down. To give you an idea how big Narsarsuaq, Greenland is, they have one road, and it's 1.5 miles long. That's it. There's residents of probably 80 people there. They have a hotel. It's a very nice hotel. And we asked them when we were there, it's like, well, what are your winters like? And they looked at us and said, you'd never survive. And they're probably right. But we left there, crossed the ice cap, and landed in Reykjavik, Iceland. And then from Iceland, we went to Prestwick, Scotland, where we stayed a few days in Prestwick, Scotland. Very nice welcome there. It was good welcome anywhere we went with that airplane because they knew about us. They knew we were coming. And then from Prestwick, we went to Duxford, England. We were invited to their big air show, their annual Duxford Air Show.
Now you're taking part in the air show. What did you do? Just park the plane and let people look at it, or was there some more to it than that?
Actually, we flew during their air show. There were 4 other C-47s or DC-3s there, and 3 of the 4 that met us there were going to meet us in France. And this was a stop-off. We all were invited, so they had us do flybys, like normal air shows would do. The planes would fly by a few times, and the other planes did paratroop jumps for the crowd. We opted out of it just because with the time constraints we had and trying to have 3 airplanes doing the drop in a small area, you'd have to wait a certain amount of time for all the guys that jumped after they land to clear everything out of the way before the next group could jump. You don't need somebody landing on somebody. So we opted out of that and we flew cover for them. We did all the, the banana passes and the low passes, high-speed passes, while they were getting ready to jump paratroopers for a demonstration.
Now, you're flying over there with a crew of 5. What were the accommodations like on the plane? I mean, you were there on the plane a day, I guess. Your seating, your food, rest stops.
We had canvas troop seats. We'd installed canvas troop seats in the aircraft. We had 18 seats.
They would have had it during the war.
Our airplane actually had metal pan seats, and they're very hard to find.
Yeah.
I have found them. I have not got them installed yet. So we went with the canvas seats that were given to us by the Canadian Warplane Heritage out of Hamilton, Ontario, which are very good friends of ours. So we had the seats. We could sit on those, lay on those. They were comfortable. I mean, they served the purpose. We had food was donated to us by Wegmans. A big case or case and a half of trail mix and Jack Link's beef jerky. It was good then. I don't want it now. It was a lot because you needed the protein.
Yeah.
In the cold weather and at that altitude, you needed the protein to keep your body going. As far as facilities, we were all very good. We could hold it a long time. It was either that or a Pepsi bottle.
What did they do during the war?
During the war, they did what they had to do. Well, they did what they had to do. Now, originally, that airplane was set up for the pilot and co-pilot. They had relief tubes. And they did have provisions for a lavatory on it, and we did too. And it was very primitive. I don't want to elaborate any more of that.
No, but was it
never
authentic?
Used, but as far as
World War II, what would have been done, or
as far as what we did, as close to it as possible.
Yeah, okay.
As close to it as possible. If you had to go, you used anything you could get your hands on. Basically.
All right. So you took part in the air show in Scotland. Were there other air shows?
The one in Duxford, yes. We didn't do any other air shows while we were over there, but we did do, after the Duxford Air Show, we flew to Ramstein, Germany, and we were there for a week.
And that's where the plane had been stationed after the war.
Correct.
Now, you said after the war, did it take part in the Berlin airlift?
Yes, our plane was involved in the Berlin airlift also.
And that what was that?
The Berlin airlift was after the war. It was the Allies at the time, the ones that were still friends after the war.
Yeah.
Of course, relations with Russia kind of fell apart after the war.
Germany was cut in half.
Germany was cut in half, and they would bring supplies in to the German people.
In Berlin.
Into Berlin.
Which was deep in the heart of East Germany.
Correct.
Berlin was cut in half, part Allied, part Communist.
Right. And they would, many C-47s, C-54s would fly supplies in to those people. And that's where one of the soldiers, airmen one day, tied little parachutes to Hershey bars. And they called it the Candy Express. Because when they flew over, they'd throw candy bars out for the kids. It was very tight flying in and flying back out because there was residential area, then there was an airstrip.
Yeah.
And they would come very close to the roofs and have to drop right down and land, and same going out. They'd have to pull up very hard to get out of there. But it was involved in the Berlin airlift.
So you went to Germany with the plane. Then there was the big commemoration.
Correct.
What happened at the D-Day commemoration?
We were staged at the Cherbourg Airport. And on D-Day itself, they had a lot of different things going on. We couldn't be involved in everything.
Sure.
We had to pick and choose what we wanted to do or what they wanted us to do. And our airplane basically flew some dignitaries, some vets and such on D-Day. So that it actually flew its route coming back in. And they'd go out over the ocean and come back in the route that they flew on D-Day. Try to get as close as they could to where their drop zones were. Myself, personally, I wasn't on that flight. As I said, a lot of our members met us over there, including Austin Wadsworth, who was the president of the National Warplane Museum. So on that day, there was Austin, his daughter Naomi, who's a pilot, and his son Craig, who's a pilot and our chief mechanic. They were the crew of the aircraft that day, because an opportunity like that's never coming around again. So they took the aircraft that day so that their family could fly it on the 70th anniversary. Myself, I was at the cemetery listening to President Obama that day. And as far as they had paratroop drops going on that day, I mean, they had all the little villages were doing their own commemoration of that day, because it was basically liberation for all of them. You know, the beginning of the end of the war for all of them. So they all had their little celebrations on that day, and then there were more celebrations 3 or 4 days ahead of it, a couple, 3 days after it. The French people were just phenomenal.
Now, you were at the cemetery.
Yes.
What was the cemetery like?
It was, if you have ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, in the beginning of the movie, it shows the older Private Ryan in modern day walking down this pathway with trees. And, you know, I always said to myself, well, I'd love to see that someday. I found myself walking down that same path. And when he turns to his left and looks out at that cemetery, and he gets that look on his face, I think I had the same look. It takes your breath away.
Now, who's buried in the cemetery?
U.S. soldiers.
The fallen of that day.
The fallen of that day. And the fallen of any other time during the war.
The Battle of the Bulge.
The Battle of the Bulge,
else.
everything. I mean, it's when you turn and look, all you see are those white headstones for as far as you can see. It's just, it kind of lets it sink in. It's like, wow, this is, you hear of all the vets that came back, and, you know, a lot of them didn't talk about the war. Some of them did. You know, there's always a few in your hometown that were involved in the war, and some that you didn't know. But to look out and see all those headstones, that kind of gave it the gravity of how many men, how many boys died for us, for freedom. And that's just one cemetery.
Yeah.
I mean, on the way from Germany to France, we stopped in Luxembourg. And we flew over the cemetery that General George S. Patton is buried in. And that cemetery is almost as big as the National Cemetery. It's just unbelievable, and it's one of 6, 7 cemeteries in Europe that are like that. And all of these cemeteries are cared for by the French people. They volunteer and they take care of this. And this place is manicured like you would not believe. I mean, it's just, they take beautiful care of it because they have that much respect for the American people, for the American GI, that got their parents or grandparents out of this war. It's just, I know I'm giving words out. It's hard to describe it when you think back on it.
It was quite moving.
It was. It's. I'm not a person that gets too emotional over things, but I did there.
Yeah.
It's just like you turn the corner and, you know, you're protected by a house and you turn a corner and the wind's blowing real bad and that wind hits you in the face the first time, kind of takes your breath away. That's exactly what happened to me. That's just what it feels like.
Now, there was a paradrop using the Whiskey 7. Were you on board for that?
Yes, I was.
What was describe that. What happened there?
We took off from the Cherbourg airport, and there were 9 aircraft total involved in this. It was the Lafleur drop zone, and 9 of us loaded up with anywhere from 12 to 18 paratroopers per airplane.
And these are present-day military paratroopers?
Yes, there's 2 groups. There's the round canopy group, and there's a group called the Liberty Jump Team, and we work with the Liberty Jump Team exclusively. They're the only ones we'll let jump out of our airplane. We have a good relationship with them. They're a great bunch of guys.
And these are active military.
Some are active military, some are retired military.
Oh, I see.
And it's the one small jump that we did on that day that was kind of nice is John Lindsay was our pilot. I was the load master, and I was the one that got to stand by the open door the whole time to pull the D-bags in. And the first paratrooper out of that aircraft was John's son and my cousin, Stuart Lindsay, who was a major in the U.S. Army Paratroop Corps. So we had 3 members of the same family. So we had our own, the Wadsworth had their little thing on D-Day, and we had ours, which was nice. But it was nine aircraft dropping reenactors, paratroopers. They did have another paratroop jump involving the Air Force, to where, and I was actually on the streets of St. Mary Glees when they did this. And it was on C-130s, anywhere from 20 to 30 paratroopers per airplane. They had 30 C-130s from all different nations. Every 30 seconds, a C-130 would fly over the village of St. Mary Glees and drop paratroopers out into the open field where they did on D-Day. And that's quite a sight to see. You sit down in the town square and watch a C-130 fly over, and then you see all these canopies floating down to the earth for them reenacting. That was their part. And that was something to see. Just unbelievable. And it got you to thinking, too, is what do those people of St. Mary Glees think? You know, a lot of it happened at night, but there are still drops during the day where they see the people they're coming to free them, see them dropping out of the sky. It was an awesome sight. You know, and like with anything, a couple mishaps here and there. Someone landed in the water. You know, someone landed on a tree, and nobody got seriously hurt. But just like it was then.
Yeah. Now, you met some interesting people in your travels.
Oh yes.
On this. One was a man named Alan Turner. Mm-hmm. Who was he?
Alan Turner is a good friend of my next door neighbor, Jan Wisely. How it came to be is her father had a journal, or a diary, whatever you want to call it, and they found it in one of the dressers.
Now they found it
in the
where?
residence, in their house in France.
In France.
I believe France or
England.
England. Yes, I'm sorry, England. They found it in an old dresser drawer.
So Jan Wisely's father was serving during the war in England.
Yes.
And he left his diary behind.
Yes, he did.
And Alan Turner found it. Mm-hmm. Then what happened?
Returned it to Jan, and there was a gentleman by the name of Brian Duddy, who Jan led, and he was good friends with Jan, still is, and he wrote a book called Invasion Stripes, and it's based on that diary. And I'm terrible with names, but it's Robert Uhrig, I believe, her father's name, and he wrote the book Invasion Stripes on that. And kind of interesting with that is Jan's been my next door neighbor since I've been, yay high, and never knew her dad was in World War II until Brian Duddy had said something to him. He says, hey, the museum has an airplane down there, a C-47, probably like your dad used to fly. Well, then he found out that it was the actual airplane that he was involved in. He was a crew chief of this airplane in North Africa and in Italy, and came with it to England. And he says, well, yeah, he says, the guy that takes care of it, or one of the guys, lives in Castile. And she says, oh, yeah, who? I know just about everybody. So he said, well, Mike Lindsay. She goes, he's my next door neighbor. Our lands border each other. And that started a real deep friendship with her.
Yeah.
And just, she's been involved with the aircraft and helping us get it restored. She's flown in the aircraft. I arranged it so she could fly in it. So it's kind of a connection between her and her dad in that aircraft. Her daughter had her reception and pictures taken with that aircraft down at the museum. So there's another generation that's kind of involved with it. And she told me about these people. Said, they're going to try to find you. I'm like, okay. I'm standing there with one of our other pilots, Skipper Heil that met us over there. And this gentleman walked up to me and said, "Hi, I'm Alan, so-and-so." I says, "Oh, okay. Hi, how you doing?" He says, "We have a mutual friend, Jan Wisely." I says, "Out of all the places," and we were at Duxford, England, and there's thousands of people there. And I'm like, "How in the world did you ever pick me out and know it was me?" He looked at me straight faced, said, "Did you ever read the back of your jacket? You're the only one like that." So I says, "Okay, you got me there." So we sat down and probably talked for half hour, 45 minutes. And he had some other documents that he'd found of her father's that she hadn't seen yet, that I got to read, and then he was going to forward them on to her. And I'm sure she has them by now. Yeah. She should, I hope. But very nice gentleman, very nice indeed. And I have his address. Now that you've mentioned his name to me again, to try to remember everything, I do have his address at home, and I do want to keep in contact with him.
Yeah. You met a veteran named Leslie Cruz Jr.
Yes.
Who was he?
Leslie Cruz Jr. was a paratrooper on D-Day, and he jumped out of our airplane. And he is the last surviving paratrooper that jumped out of our airplane on D-Day.
Yeah.
One of the women down at the museum, Dawn Shable, phenomenal as far as finding out something, started doing some digging and came up with this name. And we found a manifest that someone had, and his name was on it. So she's kind of like a pit bull on a T-bone. She's not going to give up till she gets what she wants. She found him, talked to him, and had one of our members, Sterling Harris, go down and actually interview him. And then he came up to Geneseo to talk with us.
Now, where was he living?
He lives in Pennsylvania, right around Philadelphia, just outside of Philadelphia. And he came up, and they did an interview in the hangar with him and his children. And we sat down and talked for a while, you know, and he says, "Well, I says, "Are you going to go to France?" He says, "I'm going to try." He says, "All depends on how I feel." And I said, "Okay, that's good." Well, we arranged it so he could go. And he met us over there, and he was able to take a flight in that airplane again, which was quite nice. And he enjoyed it.
So it was 70 years between flights in that plane.
Yeah, and one of us asked, one of the reenactor guys had said, "Hey, if you want to, we'll put a chute on you. You can jump." He says, "No." He says, "And I'll tell you why." He says, "I jumped into France 70 years ago, and I didn't get a good welcome. I don't want to try it again." But he sat next to that jump. We had the jump door in for this flight because we can't have it open that way. But he sat there next to that window, just his eyes glued to that landscape.
Yeah.
And as we flew over, he picked out his drop zone.
He remembered where it was.
And Whiskey 7, to my knowledge, is the only aircraft that actually hit its drop zone with its troops.
Yeah.
Because on that day, I mean, the German flak was terrible.
Sure.
And these pilots are dropping down. Some of them dropped down to 500 feet and just hit the green light and got them out of there. So they could get out of there and get back. So everybody was just scattered all over the place. But Leslie had told us that his group that jumped out of the airplane were the only ones that hit their drop zone that night.
Yeah. Now, you met Tom Brokaw.
Yes.
The NBC News anchor.
Yes,
retired.
very nice gentleman.
What was he like, and what was he doing at the Whiskey 7?
He was there for NBC News covering it, just because of his involvement with World War II history.
He wrote a famous book.
Yes, The Greatest Generation. And he's wrote a few others, too, that are very good reading books. So he was there, and Dawn Shable, kind of had this arranged to get Les Cruz and another gentleman, Bud Rice, on our aircraft with Tom Brokaw so that he could interview them. And that's what happened. And he was a very, very nice, pleasant man to talk to, very kind. I even asked, "Can I take a picture with you?" He said, "Sure." So I've got a picture of him and I on the tarmac at the Cherbourg Airport after our flight. And that was at the time when he was sick. And he's since in remission. But that was the time. And I talk about a trooper, let me tell you, because it was a little bumpy that day. And I was even feeling it. I've flown that aircraft for 8 years since we got it flying to where we want it. And it was even rough on me. And he did better than I did. And I will freely admit that. But he did a very nice interview with those gentlemen.
And he said he interviewed Leslie Cruz, who was the last surviving paratrooper of Whiskey 7. Now, he mentioned Bud Rice. Who's Bud Rice?
Bud Rice was a pilot of Whiskey 7. He actually piloted the aircraft during Operation Varsity, which was the last big operation before the German surrender. And we had him in the back, and Mr. Brokaw was interviewing everybody, and we asked him, would you like to go up front? You know, and Bud Rice says, sure, you know, I'll go up front. And they got him up there and got him talking with the pilots and put a headset on him. And finally, John Lindsay says, you want to fly the plane? He says, I'd love to. So the co-pilot at that time, because John was the pilot in command, got out of his seat, and Bud got into it. Well, at that point, I'm still sitting in the back with Mr. Cruz, and I kind of nudged Don. I'm like, you know, you ought to get Tom Brokaw up there talking to him. I mean, this isn't going to happen again. So we did. We got him up there, put headsets on him, and they recorded the conversation. He says, well, what do you think, Bud? He says, oh, this is great. You know, he's just sitting there at first, and John says, okay, it's your aircraft. You better fly it. And he took a hold of that aircraft and flew that airplane. And I was in the back with Mr. Cruz by the door. He looked at me, he goes, Bud Rice is flying a plane, isn't he? I looked up, I says, yeah, how'd you know? Flies better than your pilots. But it had been 70 years since he'd flown a big aircraft like that. He flew smaller planes after the war, private aircraft. And I can always remember this. Tom Brokaw asked him a question. He says, when was the last time you flew a C-47? He said 70 years ago in Operation Varsity, and it was this aircraft. So it had been a 70-year span of him flying a C-47, and it was the exact same aircraft. If Gary hadn't started this Return to Normandy project, none of this would have happened. You know, it's because of Gary. Unfortunately, Gary did not live to see that dream come true. But on that aircraft, we had a part of Gary with us. And that was at the request of his family. So in our minds, Gary made the flight. Gary saw his dream come true of seeing that aircraft go back to Normandy.
This is once again Gary who?
Gary Mitchell.
Gary Mitchell.
Yes. Very good member of the museum. Very good member.
Yeah.
So we were able to at least make that part happen for the family in one way.
Well, if you want to see Whiskey 7, it's on display at the National Warplane Museum in Geneseo. What are the hours of the museum?
The hours of the museum, right now they're winter hours, so it's Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 10 to 4.
And what are they the rest of the year?
The rest of the year they're open every day from 10 to 4.
And when does the annual air show take place roughly?
The annual air show is usually the second weekend in July, the weekend after the 4th. So I believe this year's dates are the 11th, 12th, and 13th of July.
It's 2015.
Yes.
If you're just tuning in, our guest tonight is Mike Lindsay, who had the adventure of a lifetime of flying as a member of the crew of the Whiskey 7 troop transport plane over to Europe for the 70th anniversary commemoration of the D-Day invasion. Once again, this was a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. What did you learn about history from this experience that you didn't know before?
I've always been a history buff. I've always enjoyed World War II history. For some reason, I don't know why, I always have. But making this trip to actually walk where those soldiers, those young men back in 70 years ago walked, to fly over the same areas that they flew over jumping out of the aircraft, it gave me a deeper appreciation of what they did. You know, Tom Brokaw coined it in his book, The Greatest Generation, and he was right. That was a generation that went above and beyond what they had to do, and they got the job done. And to be able to walk where they did, to see some of the things they saw. I mean, I see them in peacetime, they saw them during wartime. A lot of it's the same. A lot of the old buildings are still there. And you look at the old photos, and you can pick out, okay, this is this spot right here. And I did that a couple of times in St. Mary Glees. But it gave me a deeper appreciation, a deeper respect for what they did. And in my mind, that's something that can never be forgotten. I don't care if it's 70 years from now, 100 years from now, after I'm long gone, I hope somebody still keeps this going so that people can remember what happened. Because you'll never see a mobilization like that again. Never.
Well, I want to thank you for coming in and sharing your experiences, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
Once again, our guest tonight was Mike Lindsay, who was generously shared with us his experiences flying the Whiskey 7 troop transport plane over the Atlantic Ocean to Europe for the 70th anniversary commemoration of the D-Day invasion. Thank you once again for coming in. I'm Kyle Adamczak, and I'd like to thank you for watching us here at Letchworth Cable Access. Good night.